Beneath the surface of the Great Lakes lies a graveyard of over 6,000 ships, more wrecks than any ocean on Earth, and the water itself was never the true killer. Tonight we journey into the heart of these massive freshwater seas to understand why sailors feared them more than crossing the Atlantic, why indigenous peoples warned of powers beyond human understanding, and why even modern technology cannot fully tame their fury. These 5 massive lakes, Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario, hold 21% of the world's fresh surface water, stretching across 94,000 square miles of North America. Yet experienced captains who had sailed the world's oceans spoke of the Great Lakes with a particular dread, a respect born not from superstition, but from witnessing what these waters could do to ships and men. What sinks ships in fresh water is not what you think. The danger does not come from depth or distance from shore, or the creatures that swim below. The true threat emerges from a combination of physics, weather, geography, and human nature that creates conditions more treacherous than almost anywhere else on Earth. By the end of this journey, you will understand why the Great Lakes have claimed more vessels than many seas, why indigenous peoples performed rituals before crossing them, and why the water itself was never really the problem. Before we descend into this story, take a moment to settle in. Perhaps you are watching from somewhere along the shores of these great waters, or from a landlocked place where lakes are small and tame, or from across an ocean, curious about waters you have never seen. Wherever you are, this story will unfold slowly, carefully, like layers of history settling into sediment at the bottom of Superior's deepest trenches. The story of why the Great Lakes are dangerous begins not with a single shipwreck or a particular storm, but with understanding what these bodies of water truly are. They appear on maps as lakes, a word that suggests something manageable, contained, knowable. But stand on the shore of Lake Superior on a November day when the wind is rising, and you will see something else entirely. You will see waves building like ocean swells, stretching to a horizon that curves with the Earth's surface, and you will understand that you are looking at an inland sea. Chapter 1. The Freshwater Difference. Ships built for saltwater oceans sit lower in the Great Lakes because freshwater provides 3% less buoyancy than seawater, making vessels more vulnerable to swamping and capsizing. This seemingly small difference in density between salt and freshwater has killed hundreds of sailors who never understood the physics working against them until water was pouring over their decks. When a ship designed for ocean travel enters the Great Lakes, it settles deeper into the water immediately. The cargo that sat safely above the waterline in saltwater now rides closer to the surface. The freeboard, that critical distance between the water and the deck, shrinks by inches that matter desperately when waves begin to build. Captains who failed to account for this difference loaded their vessels as they would for ocean crossings, never realizing they had already sealed their fate before leaving port. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald, the most famous Great Lakes shipwreck of modern times, was loaded with 2116 long tons of taconite pellets when it departed Superior, Wisconsin on November 9, 1975. The ship was built specifically for the Great Lakes, yet even vessels designed for these waters must respect the freshwater physics. When the storm struck and waves began breaking over the deck, every inch of freeboard mattered. The ship sat lower in the water than an identical vessel would have in the ocean, and that difference meant water that might have broken against the hull instead crashed directly onto the deck. But the buoyancy difference is only the beginning of how freshwater physics betray sailors. The density variation affects ship handling in ways subtle and profound. A vessel turns differently in freshwater than in saltwater, It responds to rudder commands with slightly altered timing. For experienced ocean captains making their first Great Lakes crossings in the 1800s, these small differences in ship behavior could prove fatal in critical moments when a reef appeared through fog or a sudden squall required immediate maneuvering. The temperature of fresh water also behaves differently than the salt water in ways that affect survival. When sailors go into the water after a shipwreck, freshwater hypothermia progresses faster than in the ocean. The human body loses heat more rapidly in fresh water at the same temperature as salt water. In Lake Superior, where summer surface temperatures rarely exceed 55 degrees Fahrenheit and can drop to near freezing, in winter, a person has perhaps 20 minutes of useful consciousness before hypothermia steals the ability to swim or hold on to debris. In November, when most Great Lakes shipwrecks occur, survival time in the water measures in minutes, not hours. Great Lakes waves strike faster and closer together than ocean swells, sometimes only 5 seconds apart, battering ships relentlessly without recovery time between impacts. This wave frequency creates a punishing rhythm that overwhelms vessels in ways ocean storms do not. Ocean swells typically arrive every 10 to 20 seconds, giving ships time to rise over one wave and settle before the next arrives. The ship's hull has time to shed water, the crew has time to secure loose items, and the vessel maintains some equilibrium between waves. On the Great Lakes, especially during severe storms, waves march toward ships in rapid succession. A vessel climbs one wave, crests it, drops into the trough, and immediately begins climbing the next. There is no pause, no recovery, no moment to stabilize. The ship's bow plunges into wave after wave without respite. Water that crashes over the deck has no time to drain before the next wave adds more. Cargo shifts incrementally with each impact, slowly working free of its restraints. Crew members cannot move safely on deck because the ship never stops its violent pitching and rolling. This relentless pounding creates a cumulative effect that eventually overwhelms even large modern freighters. Metal fatigue accumulates faster under this constant stress. Welds and rivets work loose. Hatch covers that might withstand intermittent ocean waves fail under the continuous assault of Great Lakes storm waves. The ship itself becomes exhausted, like a boxer who can withstand powerful punches, but eventually falls to a rapid combination of lighter blows that never stops. Despite their size, the Great Lakes are relatively shallow compared to oceans, causing waves to build higher and steeper, creating walls of water that can break over entire vessels in minutes. Lake Superior, the deepest of the Great Lakes, reaches a maximum depth of 1,332 feet, which sounds impressive until you compare it to average ocean depth of over 12,000 feet. Lake Erie, the shallowest Great Lake, averages only 62 feet deep, with a maximum depth of 210 feet. This shallowness relative to surface area creates wave dynamics more similar to continental shelf waters than open ocean. When storm winds push water across these lakes, the waves build quickly, but cannot develop the long, rolling swells of deep ocean waters. Instead, they become steep, choppy, and close together. The wave height relative to wavelength, the distance from crest to crest, creates extraordinarily steep waves that can break like surf, rather than rolling like open ocean swells. On Lake Superior during a major storm, waves can build to heights of 30 feet or more. But instead of being long ocean rollers, they are short, steep walls of water. When a ship encounters these waves, it cannot ride over them smoothly. The bow climbs nearly vertically, then crashes down into the trough with tremendous force. If the wave is breaking, tons of water collapse directly onto the deck. A single such wave can shatter wheelhouse windows, tear away lifeboats, and bend steel deck railings. The shallow bottom also causes waves to refract and concentrate in unpredictable ways. When storm waves encounter underwater ridges or shoals, they build even higher as the bottom forces the wave energy upward. Ships that stay in deeper water, hoping to avoid the worst waves, sometimes find themselves in even more dangerous conditions when bottom topography channels wave energy into concentrated areas. Sailors describe Lake Superior's worst waves as looking like moving cliffs, green walls of water that rise suddenly in front of the ship, too steep to climb, too close to avoid. When a ship encounters such a wave, there are only seconds to brace for impact. The bow rises, the propeller comes partly out of the water and races. The whole vessel shudders, and then the crash comes. If the ship is lucky, it punches through and emerges on the other side. If not, the wave breaks over the entire forward section, and thousands of tons of water pour onto the deck. Chapter 2. The storms that appear from nowhere. Storms on the Great Lakes appear with terrifying speed, sometimes materializing in under 30 minutes, giving sailors almost no warning before conditions turn deadly. Unlike ocean storms that often give days of warning as barometric pressure falls and seas gradually build, Great Lakes storms can develop with shocking rapidity due to the unique meteorological conditions of the region. The Great Lakes sit at the boundary between northern Arctic air masses and warmer southern air masses. This positioning creates atmospheric instability, especially during spring and fall, when temperature contrasts are most extreme. A ship can depart in calm conditions with clear skies and find itself in a raging storm before reaching its destination only hours away. In October 1880, the steamship Alpena departed Grand Haven, Michigan, bound for Chicago in pleasant weather. The ship carried 60 to 80 passengers and crew, exact numbers were never determined, along with cargo and mail. Within hours of departure, a sudden storm struck Lake Michigan with such ferocity that the Alpena vanished completely. No trace of the ship was found for days. Eventually, debris and bodies washed ashore along miles of Michigan coastline. The storm had materialized so quickly that the captain likely had no warning until waves were already breaking over the ship. Modern weather forecasting has reduced but not eliminated this danger. The National Weather Service maintains dedicated marine forecasting services for the Great Lakes, and ships today carry sophisticated weather detection equipment. Yet even now, localized severe weather can develop faster than forecasts predict. Bands of intense precipitation and wind can form along lake effect boundaries and strike with minimal warning. Sailors knew November as the deadliest month, when Arctic air clashes with warmer lake water, spawning violent storms that claimed entire fleets in single nights. The phenomenon occurs because lakes retain summer heat longer than surrounding land. By November, the land has cooled significantly, but lake surface temperatures remain relatively warm. When Arctic cold fronts sweep south across the Great Lakes, they encounter this warm water and the temperature contrast becomes explosive. The warm lake water evaporates rapidly into the cold air, adding enormous moisture and energy to storm systems. The rising water vapor condenses and releases latent heat, further intensifying the storm. Wind speeds can increase dramatically over very short distances. A ship might be experiencing 30-mile-per-hour winds and within an hour face 70-mile-per-hour gales. The Great Storm of 1913, also known as the White Hurricane, demonstrated the catastrophic potential of November storms on the Great Lakes. From November 7 through November 10, 1913, a massive storm system stalled over the Great Lakes region and intensified into one of the most powerful storms ever recorded on freshwater. The storm generated wind gusts over 90 miles per hour and waves estimated at 35 feet or higher. The storm's timing was particularly deadly because shipping season was nearing its end, and companies were pushing to complete final runs before winter ice closed the lakes. Ships that might have remained in port during mid-season storms were ordered out because of economic pressure to maximize cargo deliveries. Captains who recognized the danger were overruled by company officials who insisted the ships could outrun the weather. Over those 3 days in November 1913, the storm destroyed 19 large ships and damaged 19 others across all 5 lakes. More than 250 sailors died, with some ships vanishing so completely that they have never been found despite extensive searches. The Charles S. Price, a 524-foot bulk freighter, was found capsized in Lake Huron, with its entire crew lost. The ship had flipped completely upside down, its hull rising above the surface, while the superstructure was submerged. For days, the overturned hull was mistaken for another vessel because no one could believe a ship that large could capsize completely. Bodies washed ashore for weeks after the storm. Many were frozen, preserved by the cold November water. Some were found still wearing life jackets, having survived the initial sinking only to die from hypothermia while floating in the freezing lake. The storm's aftermath revealed that several ships had literally broken apart in the waves, torn to pieces by forces that exceeded their structural capacity to withstand. Localized wind events called microbursts strike without warning, generating winds over 100 miles per hour in concentrated areas, flipping ships that had been sailing in calm waters moments before. Microbursts are intense downdrafts from thunderstorms that hit the surface and spread out in all directions, creating straight-line winds of extraordinary power in very localized areas. On the Great Lakes, microburst events can catch ships in situations where one side of the vessel experiences calm conditions, while the other side is blasted by hurricane-force winds. This asymmetric wind loading can heel a ship over so quickly that crew members have no time to react. Cargo shifts, water floods through openings, and the ship capsizes in seconds. The sudden nature of microburst winds means they often strike without any advance warning signs that sailors can observe. The sky might show some storm clouds, but nothing indicating imminent danger. Then, without any gradual increase in wind speed, the full force of the microburst strikes. Winds go from 10 miles per hour to 100 miles per hour in seconds. Rigging snaps, sails shred if they are set, and the ship is knocked sideways. Modern Doppler weather radar can sometimes detect the signatures of developing microbursts, allowing forecasters to issue warnings. However, microbursts are small-scale events that can form and strike in the time it takes, a warning to be issued and received. A ship might receive a severe weather warning and be hit by a microburst before the crew can even respond to the warning. Fog rolls across the lakes with blinding thickness, erasing landmarks and shorelines completely, leaving captains disoriented and sailing blind toward rocky shoals and reefs. Great Lakes fog forms through several mechanisms, all of which can create visibility conditions that drop to zero within minutes. Advection fog occurs when warm, moist air moves across cooler lake water. The air cools to its dew point and moisture condenses into fog. This type of fog is common in spring when warming air temperatures contrast with still cold lake water. The fog can be extremely dense and can persist for days if atmospheric conditions remain stable. Radiation fog forms on calm, clear nights when land cools rapidly and then drifts out over the water. This fog is typically shallower but can completely obscure navigation markers and shoreline references that sailors use for positioning. Before electronic navigation, ships relied on visual references to determine their position and avoid hazards. Lighthouses, landmarks, depth soundings, and dead reckoning were the only tools available. When fog eliminated visibility, captains were essentially blind. They could only estimate their position based on their last known location, their speed, and their heading, adjusting for estimated wind and current effects. The margin for error in this navigation method was enormous. A slight miscalculation in speed, a current that pushed the ship sideways without the crew knowing, or a compass error could place the ship miles from where the captain believed it to be. Many ships have run aground in fog, while their captains believed they were in safe, deep water, far from shore. The Straits of Mackinac, connecting Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, were particularly dangerous in fog. The narrow passage forced all traffic through a confined area studded with islands and shoals. Ships would slow to minimal speed and proceed based on whistle signals and sound bearings, trying to navigate through the straits without hitting land or other vessels. Collisions between ships were common in Mackinac fog, with vessels materializing out of the whiteness too close to avoid impact. Even after radar became available on ships, fog remained dangerous because radar cannot detect all hazards. Small boats, floating debris, and ice can be invisible to radar, especially older radar systems. Modern GPS navigation has largely eliminated the problem of not knowing where the ship is located, but fog still prevents visual detection of hazards and requires reduced speed and increased vigilance. Chapter 3. The Hidden Geography of Destruction. Hidden beneath the surface lie submerged reefs, rock formations, and sudden depth, changes that could rip open hulls without any visible warning from above. The Great Lakes bottom topography is complex and varied, shaped by glacial action that carved deep trenches and left behind scattered rock formations, some rising to within feet of the surface in otherwise deep water. Lake Superior contains hundreds of charted underwater hazards, and possibly many more that remain uncharted in remote areas. Reefs can rise suddenly from depths of 100 feet or more to within 10 or 20 feet of the surface. In calm conditions with clear water, these reefs might be visible to alert lookouts. But in storms at night or in murky water, they are invisible death traps. A ship passing over a reef at high speed can strike with tremendous force, tearing open the bottom hull plates. If the ship is loaded with heavy cargo, the momentum carries it forward even as water floods into the hull. By the time the engines can be stopped and reversed, the ship may have traveled hundreds of feet past the reef, leaving a trail of debris and taking on fatal amounts of water. Some reefs have claimed multiple ships over the years, each wreck adding to the hazard. Shipwrecks themselves become underwater obstructions that can damage other vessels. In areas of heavy historical traffic, the bottom may be littered with debris from previous sinkings, creating additional hazards that do not appear on navigation charts. The Keweenaw Peninsula on the southern shore of Lake Superior extends into the lake and creates a complex underwater topography of rocks, reefs, and shoals. The area has claimed dozens of ships, many of which struck underwater rocks while trying to round the peninsula in storms. The remains of these wrecks still litter the bottom, some in shallow enough water to be hazards to modern vessels. Straits connecting the lakes force ships through confined channels where currents accelerate, winds funnel with increased force, and one navigation error means certain destruction. The Great Lakes are connected by relatively narrow passages that create choke points for navigation. The Straits of Mackinac, the Detroit River, the St. Clair River, and the Niagara River all funnel the flow of water between lakes, creating current and navigation hazards. In the Straits of Mackinac, currents can exceed 3 miles per hour, which is significant for ship handling. A ship making 10 miles per hour through the water might be making 13 miles per hour over the ground in a following current or only 7 miles per hour in an opposing current. This affects navigation calculations and can push ships off their intended course if captains do not accurately account for current effects. The straits also funnel wind. When wind blows along the axis of the strait, it accelerates through the narrow passage like air through a venturi. A 30-mile-per-hour wind over open Lake Michigan might become a 45-mile-per-hour wind through the straits. This wind acceleration can catch captains by surprise, suddenly, making conditions much more difficult just when the navigation situation is most demanding. The presence of islands in these straits creates additional hazards. Bois Blanc Island, Round Island, and Mackinac Island sit in or near the Straits of Mackinac, dividing the passage and creating multiple channels. In fog or at night, determining which channel the ship is in and where the islands are located has been the difference between safe passage and disaster. The Detroit River, connecting Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair, is only about 20 miles long, but flows through a major urban area and handles enormous ship traffic. The river has strong currents, a winding channel, and many bridges that ships must pass under with limited clearance. Navigation errors have caused ships to hit bridge supports, run aground, or collide with other vessels in the confined waters. Winter transforms the lakes into shifting mazes of ice floes, pressure ridges, and frozen channels that can trap ships for months or crush wooden hulls like paper. Before modern ice-breaking technology, winter ice effectively closed the Great Lakes to shipping for several months each year. Ships would make a final run in late November or early December, trying to complete one last cargo delivery before ice became impassable. This economic pressure to squeeze in one more trip led to many disasters. Captains would depart knowing ice was forming, gambling that they could complete the round trip before conditions became too dangerous. Ships would enter narrow channels and find them partially frozen, with no room to turn around. Ice would form behind them, cutting off escape, and they would be trapped until spring. Ice pressure could crush wooden ship hulls. As ice formed and expanded, or as wind pushed ice floes together, the pressure built to thousands of tons per square foot. Wooden hulls would groan and crack under this pressure, timbers breaking and hull planks splitting. The ship would slowly be crushed, timbers collapsing inward, until the vessel sank or broke apart completely. Even modern steel ships can be damaged or trapped by ice. In 1976, the Coast Guard icebreaker Mackinac became trapped in ice on Lake Superior and required assistance from another icebreaker to be freed. If an icebreaker designed specifically to operate in ice can become trapped, commercial vessels are even more vulnerable. Ice also creates hidden hazards. Thick ice can cover rocks and reefs, concealing them from lookouts while still being thin enough for a ship to break through. The ship crashes through the ice and strikes the hidden rock beneath, sustaining damage while surrounded by ice that makes rescue or repair attempts extremely difficult. Chapter 4. The Spirits in the Water. Great Lakes, tribal nations spoke of powerful spirits dwelling within the waters, entities that demanded respect and could conjure storms to punish those who showed arrogance or disrespect. The indigenous peoples who lived around the Great Lakes for thousands of years before European contact developed deep spiritual and practical knowledge of these waters. The Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Menominee, and other Great Lakes tribes traveled extensively on the lakes in birch bark canoes, fishing, trading, and moving between seasonal settlements. Their survival depended on reading weather signs, understanding lake conditions, and knowing when to travel and when to remain ashore. This practical knowledge was inseparable from spiritual belief in the living power of the lakes. Ojibwe traditions named Lake Superior Gitchagumi, meaning Great Sea, or Big Water, teaching that the lake possessed a living consciousness that chose which vessels would pass safely and which would be claimed forever. The lake was not simply a body of water, but a being with awareness, intention, and power. Travelers asked permission before crossing and offered thanks for safe passage. This worldview recognized what modern science confirms. The Great Lakes are powerful, dynamic systems capable of sudden, violent changes that can kill those who do not respect them. The spiritual framework through which indigenous peoples understood this reality was different from modern scientific explanation, but the underlying truth was the same. These waters demand respect, and arrogance invites disaster. Anishinaabe people warned of Mishipeshu, an underwater panther spirit with a copper tail who dwelled in the deepest parts of Lake Superior, creating whirlpools and capsizing canoes of those who angered it. Mishipeshu is described in traditional stories as a creature combining features of a panther, serpent, and dragon, with a long copper tail and a spiny back. Pictographs depicting Mishipeshu appear on rock faces along Lake Superior's shore, painted hundreds of years ago by Anishinaabe artists. Mishipeshu was associated with copper, which was and is abundant in the Lake Superior region. The Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale contain some of the purest native copper deposits in the world, and indigenous peoples mined this copper for thousands of years, trading it across North America. The copper was sacred, associated with the underwater powers, and had to be obtained with proper respect and ritual. Whirlpools on Lake Superior were particularly feared as manifestations of Mishipeshu's power. These could form in areas where conflicting currents met or where water funneled through narrow passages between rocks. A canoe caught in such a whirlpool could be pulled under and swimmers dragged down into the dark depths where Mishipeshu dwelled. Modern understanding recognizes that whirlpools and strong local currents are real hazards on the Great Lakes, caused by wind-driven currents, thermal circulation, and bottom topography effects. The indigenous explanation attributed these phenomena to a spiritual being, but the practical warning was the same. These specific locations are dangerous and must be avoided or navigated with extreme caution. Indigenous sailors placed tobacco offerings on the water before journeys, acknowledging the lake's power and asking permission to travel, a practice some modern sailors still quietly continue. Tobacco was sacred to Great Lakes peoples, used in ceremonies and as an offering to spirits. Before departing on a journey, travelers would place a pinch of tobacco on the water, often speaking a prayer or simply maintaining a respectful silence as the offering was made. This ritual served multiple purposes. It reinforced respect for the water and recognition of its power. It created a moment of mindfulness before departure, allowing travelers to assess conditions and their own readiness carefully, and it connected travelers to generations of ancestors who had crossed these same waters, carrying forward a tradition that linked past and present. The offering ritual also created psychological preparation for danger. By acknowledging the possibility of not returning, travelers confronted their mortality and entered the journey with appropriate seriousness. This is quite different from the attitude of some 19th century commercial captains who viewed the lakes as obstacles to overcome through force of will and mechanical power, an attitude that often led to disaster. Today, some Native American and First Nations people continue the practice of tobacco offerings when traveling on the lakes. Some non-Indigenous people who have spent significant time around traditional communities have also adopted the practice, recognizing its value even if they do not share the same spiritual framework. Commercial fishermen, recreational sailors, and others whose lives depend on the lakes sometimes quietly make offerings, maintaining a tradition thousands of years old. The question of whether the spiritual explanations are literally true is separate from the question of whether the traditions contain practical wisdom. Even from a purely secular perspective, the indigenous approach to the Great Lakes, treating them as powerful, dangerous, and deserving of deep respect, is more accurate and safer than viewing them as mere shipping routes to be conquered. Chapter 5: Human Choices and Economic Pressures. Shipping companies pushed captains to sail in dangerous conditions to meet delivery schedules, especially before winter freeze, leading crews into storms they knew could kill them. The economics of Great Lakes shipping created powerful incentives to take risks, and those incentives have contributed to hundreds of shipwrecks and thousands of deaths. Great Lakes bulk carriers typically transported iron ore, coal, grain, limestone, and other bulk commodities. The shipping season ran from approximately April through November, constrained by winter ice. During these 8 months, ships and owners had to generate enough revenue to cover annual expenses and hopefully turn a profit. This created pressure to maximize the number of trips each ship could complete during the season. Each day a ship sat in port waiting for better weather was a day of lost revenue. The ship still incurred costs, crew wages, dock fees, insurance, but generated no income. Cargo waited to be delivered, with steel mills needing ore, grain elevators needing to be emptied before new harvests arrived, and power plants requiring coal. Customers expected delivery on schedule and would take their business elsewhere if shipments were delayed. This economic reality meant captains faced constant pressure from ship owners to depart on schedule, regardless of weather forecasts. A captain who delayed departure for safety reasons might be praised if severe weather subsequently materialized, but would be criticized if conditions turned out to be manageable. A captain who consistently delayed for weather would be seen as overly cautious and might be replaced with someone more willing to take risks. Many ships sank on what crews called one last trip before winter layup, when exhausted sailors pushed aging vessels through deteriorating weather to maximize seasonal profits. The final trips of the shipping season were particularly dangerous because multiple risk factors converged. First, weather deteriorated as winter approached. November storms on the Great Lakes are notoriously violent, yet November was when companies pushed hardest to complete final deliveries. Second, crews were exhausted after months of continuous work, making them less alert and more prone to errors. Third, ships often needed maintenance after a full season of operations, but repairs were deferred until winter layup to avoid losing operating days during the season. The result was that the final trips often put tired crews on ships needing repair into the worst weather of the year, all because of economic pressure to complete one more cargo run. Sailors knew they were taking excessive risks but had limited power to refuse. Jobs were valuable, and ship owners would simply find more willing crews if the current crew refused to sail. The Edmund Fitzgerald's final voyage in November 1975 fit this pattern. The ship departed Superior, Wisconsin on November 9th, heading for a steel mill in Detroit with a load of taconite pellets. November 9th was late in the season, and weather forecasts indicated a major storm was developing. The Fitzgerald had experienced some maintenance issues earlier in the season that had not been fully resolved. Captain Ernest McSorley was an experienced Great Lakes captain who certainly understood the risks but sailed anyway because the cargo needed to be delivered and the season was ending. The storm that struck the Fitzgerald was severe, but not unprecedented. The ship should have been able to handle the conditions if everything went right. But on ships operated at the edge of their capabilities by tired crews late in the season, everything does not always go right. Something failed, exactly what remains debated, and the ship went down with all 29 crew members, never sending a distress call, sinking so quickly that no one escaped. For decades, Great Lakes navigation relied on visual landmarks and dead reckoning, with no radar or GPS, meaning fog or snow could transform familiar routes into death traps instantly. Understanding the technological limitations under which early Great Lakes sailors operated helps explain why so many ships were lost. Until the mid-20th century, a captain determined the ship's position by visual observations of landmarks, lighthouses, and coastal features. The captain would identify a recognizable point on shore, note its bearing relative to the ship, and plot that line on a chart. By taking bearings on multiple landmarks, the captain could triangulate the ship's position where the bearing lines crossed on the chart. This method worked well in clear weather during daytime, but was useless in fog, at night, or in snow. Without visual references, the captain had only dead reckoning, calculating position based on the ship's course and speed from the last known position, adjusting for estimated wind and current effects. Dead reckoning positions became increasingly uncertain with every hour that passed without visual confirmation. The consequences of this navigational uncertainty were severe. Ships would enter fog knowing approximately where they were, but with increasing doubt about their exact position. Captains would reduce speed and post extra lookouts, but had no choice except to continue based on dead reckoning calculations. If those calculations were wrong, the first indication might be rocks tearing through the hull. Radar began appearing on commercial ships in the 1940s and became common by the 1960s. Radar allowed ships to detect land, other vessels, and significant weather features without visual contact. But early radar systems had limitations. They could not reliably detect small objects, resolution was poor at close ranges, and interpretation required skill and experience. GPS navigation became available for civilian use in the 1980s and revolutionized marine navigation. For the first time, ships could know their exact position within meters anywhere on the lakes, in any weather, at any time. GPS has dramatically reduced navigational accidents, though it has not eliminated them entirely, because GPS tells you where you are, but not necessarily where hazards are, if charts are inaccurate or if temporary hazards like floating debris exist. Chapter 6. The famous disasters that defined the lakes. On November 10, 1975, the massive ore freighter Edmund Fitzgerald vanished in a Lake Superior storm, with all 29 crew members, sinking so fast it never sent a distress signal. The Fitzgerald disaster became the most famous Great Lakes shipwreck due to its shocking nature. A modern ship equipped with current safety equipment and operated by an experienced crew simply disappeared. And because Gordon Lightfoot's song, "The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald," brought the story to millions who had never heard of the Great Lakes shipping industry. The Fitzgerald was built in 1958 and was the largest ship on the Great Lakes at the time of its construction. At 729 feet long, it could carry massive loads of iron ore from Lake Superior ports to steel mills on the lower lakes. The ship was well maintained, regularly inspected, and operated by the Columbia Transportation Division of Ogle Bay Norton Company, a respected Great Lakes shipping firm. On November 9, 1975, the Fitzgerald loaded 26 1/16 long tons of taconite pellets at the Burlington Northern Railroad dock in Superior, Wisconsin. Captain Ernest McSorley, a 44-year Great Lakes shipping veteran, commanded the ship. Weather forecasts indicated a storm was developing, but McSorley had been through many storms and had confidence in his ship. The Fitzgerald departed Superior around 2 p.m., bound for Detroit. By the next afternoon, the storm had intensified into a major Lake Superior gale with winds over 50 miles per hour and waves reaching 25 feet or higher. The Fitzgerald was traveling eastward across Lake Superior, along with another ore carrier, the Arthur M. Anderson. The two captains maintained radio contact, and Captain McSorley reported that the Fitzgerald had sustained some damage, including fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list to one side. At around 7 p.m. on November 10th, the Anderson's radar showed the Fitzgerald about 10 to 15 miles ahead. At 7 p.m., the Anderson called the Fitzgerald by radio. Captain McSorley reported, "We are holding our own." Those were the last words ever heard from the Fitzgerald. Minutes later, the ship vanished from the Anderson's radar screen and never reappeared. The Anderson immediately began searching, but found nothing in the darkness and storm. Coast Guard rescue attempts were launched, but no survivors were found. No lifeboats had been deployed. No distress calls had been sent. The ship had simply ceased to exist in a matter of minutes, taking all 29 men to the bottom of Lake Superior. The wreck was located several days later in 530 feet of water, broken into 2 main sections. The bow section was upright and relatively intact, but the stern section was severely damaged and inverted. The ship had clearly suffered a catastrophic structural failure of some kind, breaking apart and sinking before the crew could react. Multiple investigations attempted to determine what caused the sinking, but no definitive answer emerged. Theories included taking on water through damaged hatch covers, striking an underwater shoal, and tearing open the hull, structural failure of the hull itself, or massive waves breaking over the deck and flooding the ship. Each theory had supporting evidence, but also problems. The true cause remains disputed nearly 50 years later. What is certain is that a large, modern, well-maintained ship operated by experienced sailors sank in conditions that, while severe, should have been survivable. The Fitzgerald's loss demonstrated that the Great Lakes remain dangerous regardless of ship size or technology, a lesson written in the names of 29 men who never came home. Over 3 days in November 1913, a massive storm system destroyed 19 ships and damaged 19 others across all 5 lakes, killing over 250 sailors in what became known as the White Hurricane. The Great Storm of 1913 remains the deadliest natural disaster in Great Lakes history and one of the worst maritime disasters in U.S. history. The storm system began forming on November 7, 1913, as a low-pressure area developed over the Great Lakes region. Normally, such systems would move eastward and dissipate, but this one stalled over the lakes and intensified dramatically. Cold Arctic air poured down from Canada, while warm, moist air pushed up from the Gulf of Mexico. The two air masses collided over the Great Lakes, and the resulting storm reached historic intensity. Wind speeds exceeded 90 miles per hour, with some estimates of gusts over 100 miles per hour. Waves built to heights estimated at 35 feet or more, though measurements were difficult because instruments were destroyed and observation posts were often cut off by the storm. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to near zero. The combination of wind, waves, and snow created whiteout conditions where sailors could see nothing beyond the ship, not knowing where they were or where hazards lay. The storm struck when shipping season was nearing its end, and many ships were attempting final runs before winter closure. Captains who might have waited out the storm in mid-season felt pressure to complete deliveries. Many ships departed into deteriorating weather, and those already on the lakes found themselves in conditions that worsened rapidly beyond any ability to reach shelter. On Lake Huron, 8 large freighters, the Charles S. Price, Regina, John A. McGean, James Carruthers, Hydrus, Argus, Wexford, and the barge Plymouth, were lost with all hands. The ship simply disappeared, never heard from again after the storm caught them. Search parties later found some of the wrecks, but several have never been located despite extensive searches. The Charles S. Price was found floating upside down, its hull above water, but the superstructure submerged. All 28 crew members were lost. The ship had been flipped completely over by the storm, likely capsizing when hit by a massive breaking wave that rolled it beyond the point of no return. Bodies washed ashore for weeks after the storm, sometimes dozens of miles from where the ships went down. Many bodies were never identified because the ship's crew lists were incomplete, lost with the ships, or never maintained properly. Entire families lost fathers, brothers, and sons, sometimes never receiving confirmation of what happened or where the bodies were found. The storm's aftermath led to improvements in weather forecasting, ship design standards, and safety regulations. But it also left a scar on Great Lakes communities that remains to this day. Monuments in port towns list the names of lost ships and sailors, and annual remembrance ceremonies honor those who died in the White Hurricane. In 1679, the first European sailing ship on the upper Great Lakes, the Griffin, vanished with all hands on its maiden voyage, never to be found despite centuries of searching. The Griffin holds a unique place in Great Lakes history as the first major shipwreck mystery, a mystery that has never been solved. The Griffin was built by René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, a French explorer seeking to establish a trading network throughout the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley. La Salle needed a ship capable of carrying large quantities of trade goods and furs, something larger than the canoes previously used for travel on the lakes. The Griffin was constructed at a site near present-day Buffalo, New York, at the eastern end of Lake Erie. The ship was approximately 45 tons burden and carried 7 cannon. While small by ocean standards, it was the largest sailing vessel yet built on the Great Lakes. La Salle intended to use the Griffin to establish French dominance over Great Lakes trade, and to transport goods for his planned expedition down the Mississippi River. The Griffin was launched in 1679 and sailed through Lake Erie, up the Detroit River, across Lake St. Clair, up the St. Clair River, into Lake Huron, through the Straits of Mackinac, and into Lake Michigan. At Washington Island, near the entrance to Green Bay, the ship took on a load of furs that had been collected by traders waiting for transportation. La Salle sent the Griffin back toward Niagara with the furs while he continued his explorations by canoe. The Griffin departed Washington Island in September 1679 with a crew of 6 men under the command of the pilot, Luke the Dane. The ship was never seen again. It never arrived at Niagara, no wreckage was found, and no survivors appeared. The ship and all 6 crew members vanished completely. Theories about the Griffin's fate include sinking in a storm, running aground on a reef, capsizing in a sudden squall, being destroyed by hostile Native Americans, or even being deliberately scuttled by its crew who wanted to steal the valuable fur cargo. Various wrecks discovered over the centuries have been claimed as the Griffin, but none have been definitively proven. The Griffin's disappearance established a pattern that would repeat hundreds of times over the next 3 centuries. Ships departing into Great Lakes weather and simply vanishing, leaving no survivors, no wreckage, no answers. The lake keeps its secrets, and the Griffin was only the first of many. Chapter 7. Modern technology cannot tame the lakes. Even with modern technology, GPS, radar, and weather forecasting, the Great Lakes still claim vessels, proving that the fundamental dangers of these waters have never been conquered. While shipping safety has improved dramatically since the early 20th century, the lakes remain capable of overwhelming human efforts to control them. In November 1989, the freighter Jupiter sank in Lake Superior during a storm, fortunately without loss of life. The ship had departed Superior, Wisconsin, with a load of taconite pellets when a severe storm struck. The Jupiter took on water and developed a list. The captain radioed for assistance, and the Coast Guard dispatched helicopters. In a dramatic rescue operation conducted in severe weather, all 24 crew members were lifted off the sinking ship. The Jupiter went down in 900 feet of water, joining the thousands of wrecks already resting on the lake bottom. The Jupiter sinking demonstrated that even relatively modern ships, the Jupiter was built in 1943 and had been refurbished and maintained, remain vulnerable in Great Lakes storms. The ship had all the navigation and communication technology available in 1989, but technology does not prevent water from flooding a hull or keep waves from breaking over decks. In December 2000, the Canadian grain carrier Maumee suffered a cargo shift in a Lake Superior storm and developed a severe list. The ship took on water and lost propulsion. The crew sent a distress call, and rescue operations were launched. All 22 crew members were successfully evacuated before the ship sank. The Maumee went down in 150 feet of water off the Keweenaw Peninsula, adding another wreck to Superior's collection. These relatively recent sinkings, along with numerous cases of ships sustaining major damage but managing to reach port, demonstrate that the Great Lakes have not been tamed. The same weather patterns, wave dynamics, and geographical hazards that sank wooden ships in the 1800s still sink steel ships today. Modern ships are stronger and more capable than historical vessels, but the lakes can still generate conditions that exceed the limits of human engineering. The fundamental physics have not changed. Fresh water still provides less buoyancy than salt water. Waves still build steep and close together on these relatively shallow inland seas. Storms still develop with frightening speed, and human beings still make errors in judgment, especially when economic pressure pushes them to take risks. The Great Lakes will likely claim more ships in the future. Climate change may actually increase some risks as warming temperatures lead to more variable weather patterns and more intense storm systems. The shipping season may extend as ice forms later and melts earlier, but that extension may put ships on the lakes during traditionally dangerous months like early December and late March. What has changed is technology's ability to save lives if not ships. Modern communication systems allow distressed vessels to call for help immediately. GPS allows rescue forces to locate ships precisely. Helicopters can reach ships and lift off crew members in conditions where rescue by boat would be impossible. Survival suits allow crew members to survive in cold water much longer than historical sailors could. The result is that modern Great Lakes disasters rarely result in total loss of life. The Edmund Fitzgerald was an exception, a case where the ship sank so quickly no one could escape. But in most recent incidents, ships have been lost while crews were saved. Technology has made the difference between ship sunk, crew lost, and ship sunk, crew rescued. Yet the lakes still kill. Recreational boaters drown every year in accidents on the Great Lakes. Small commercial vessels are occasionally lost. The possibility of another major disaster like the Edmund Fitzgerald cannot be ruled out. The lakes are patient, powerful, and always dangerous. Chapter 8. The water was never really the problem. The Great Lakes are dangerous not because of the water itself, but because of the unique combination of physics, weather, geography, and human psychology that transforms these freshwater seas into graveyards, a truth native peoples understood long before the first European ship ever sailed into disaster. Water does not actively try to sink ships or drown sailors. Water simply exists, obeying physical laws, responding to wind and pressure and gravity. The Great Lakes water is not poisonous or corrosive or somehow malevolent. Ships do not sink because the water is fresh rather than salt, though the difference in buoyancy contributes to risk. Ships sink because of waves, winds, storms, rocks, ice, human error, mechanical failure, and economic pressure, factors that would be dangerous in any body of water, but are particularly concentrated and amplified on the Great Lakes. Understanding this distinction is important because it shifts focus from the water as an abstract danger to the specific mechanisms of risk that can be analyzed, predicted, and sometimes avoided. The lakes themselves are not malevolent, though indigenous spiritual traditions personified them as beings with intention, but they are powerful and unforgiving of mistakes. What makes the Great Lakes uniquely dangerous is the convergence of multiple risk factors in a relatively confined area. The size of the lakes is large enough to generate ocean-like conditions, but small enough that ships cannot outrun storms as they might on the ocean. Weather systems move across the lakes quickly, giving minimal warning, unlike oceanic storms that can be tracked for days. The combination of size and shallowness creates steep, close-spaced waves more punishing than ocean swells. The northern location means cold water that kills quickly and ice that traps and crushes ships. Add to these natural factors the human elements: economic pressure to maximize shipping efficiency, the psychology of risk-taking, the gradual erosion of caution that comes from successful trips in moderately dangerous conditions, and the occasional captain or crew who are simply unlucky or make a critical error at the wrong moment. The indigenous approach to the Great Lakes recognized all of this in a different framework. By treating the lakes as powerful spiritual beings requiring respect, indigenous traditions encoded practical safety wisdom in religious practice. The tobacco offerings, the prayers for safe passage, the reluctance to travel in certain conditions or at certain times, all of this represented an accurate assessment of risk expressed through spiritual metaphor. Modern secular society tends to dismiss such practices as superstition, yet the underlying truth remains valid. The Great Lakes are powerful, dangerous, and demand respect. Ships and sailors that treat the lakes casually or ignore warnings often pay with their lives. Those who approach the lakes with appropriate caution and humility are more likely to survive. When we say it was never the water, we mean that the danger does not come from some mystical property of Great Lakes water that makes it different from other water. The danger comes from the context in which that water exists, the weather systems that move over it, the geography beneath and around it, the seasonal patterns that affect it, and the human decisions that determine who travels on it and when. A person swimming in a lake on a calm summer day faces minimal danger from the water itself. That same person swimming in the same location during a November gale faces mortal danger, not because the water has changed its fundamental nature, but because wind, waves, and cold transform the context entirely. Ships crossing the Great Lakes in June, with good weather forecasts and moderate loading, face manageable risks. Ships crossing in November, carrying maximum cargo with a storm approaching, face dramatically higher risks. The water has not changed, but everything else has. This contextual understanding of Great Lakes danger helps explain why some ships make thousands of crossings safely while others sink on their maiden voyage. It is not random luck, though chance plays a role. It is the accumulation of risk factors and the quality of decisions made by captains and crews in response to those factors. The best Great Lakes captains have always understood this. They read weather signs carefully. They know their ship's capabilities and limitations. They understand the geography of the lakes in detail, knowing where hazards lurk and where shelter can be found. They maintain their ships meticulously because they know that mechanical failure in a storm can be fatal, and they are willing to delay departure or seek shelter when conditions warrant, even when that decision has economic costs. The worst Great Lakes disasters have often resulted when captains ignored these principles, either through inexperience, overconfidence, or external pressure. The White Hurricane of 1913 caught experienced captains who had survived many storms but chose to sail into deteriorating conditions because the season was ending and cargo needed to be delivered. The Edmund Fitzgerald sank under a captain with decades of experience who had made the same crossing hundreds of times and likely believed his ship could handle whatever Lake Superior threw at it. In both cases, and in hundreds of others throughout Great Lakes history, the water itself was not the problem. The water simply responded to wind by forming waves and responded to gravity by filling hulls when structural integrity failed. The problem was the storm, the waves, the hidden reef, the cargo shift, the hatch failure, the human decision to be on the lake at that particular time, in those particular conditions. Indigenous peoples understood this truth through their spiritual framework. Modern sailors understand it through physics and meteorology. The conclusion is the same. Respect the power of these waters, acknowledge the limitations of human control, and never assume that size, technology, or experience guarantee safety. The Great Lakes have humbled every generation of sailors that has crossed them. Wooden sailing ships, early steamers, massive steel freighters, recreational yachts, all have been lost. The lakes do not discriminate based on ship type or era. They simply exist, powerful and dangerous, waiting for the moment when conditions and human choices align to create disaster. Conclusion: the eternal truth of the lakes. The Great Lakes are dangerous not because of anything inherent in the water molecules that fill their basins, but because they represent a unique convergence of factors that challenge human ambitions to control and dominate natural forces. They are large enough to generate powerful wave systems, but too small to allow ships to escape by outrunning storms. They sit at a geographical and meteorological boundary where Arctic and temperate air masses collide, spawning sudden, violent weather. Their bottoms hide reefs and rocks and shipwrecks. Their northern latitude means cold water and seasonal ice, and human economic activity pressures sailors to take risks they know are dangerous, because cargo must be delivered and profits must be made. For over 300 years, European and American sailors have learned these lessons, usually the hard way. Thousands of ships rest on the bottom of these lakes. Thousands of sailors never came home. Each wreck represents a story of human ambition, meeting natural power and natural power winning. Yet shipping continues on the Great Lakes because economic necessity outweighs the costs of occasional disasters. Iron ore must reach steel mills. Grain must reach markets. Coal must reach power plants. The lakes provide a transportation route that is efficient, cost-effective, and irreplaceable for moving bulk cargo across the North American interior. Society accepts the risk because the benefits are substantial, and because modern safety improvements have reduced, though not eliminated, the loss of life. The indigenous peoples who lived around these lakes for millennia, before Europeans arrived, developed a relationship with the waters based on respect, caution, and spiritual awareness of power beyond human control. They traveled when conditions allowed and remained ashore when danger threatened. They made offerings to acknowledge the lake's power and asked permission to cross. They passed down stories of Mishipeshu and other spirits as warnings encoded in religious tradition. Modern society has largely abandoned that spiritual framework replacing it with scientific understanding of weather, waves, and ship design. Yet the fundamental truth remains unchanged. The Great Lakes are powerful, dangerous, and will kill those who fail to respect them. The framework for understanding may have shifted from spiritual to scientific, but the practical wisdom is the same. As climate change alters weather patterns and economic pressures continue to push shipping to its limits, the Great Lakes will likely continue claiming ships and sailors. Each generation believes it has finally mastered these waters through superior technology or knowledge, and each generation eventually learns, usually through tragedy, that the lakes have not been mastered. The water itself was never the problem. The problem is believing that human control extends to forces beyond our ability to dominate. The lakes teach humility to those willing to learn. For those who refuse the lesson, the lakes become teachers of a different sort, and the tuition is paid in ships and lives. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, consider the darkness beneath the surface of Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. Consider the wrecks resting in that darkness, some in shallow water where divers visit them, others in depth so great they will never be seen again. Consider the sailors who went down with those ships, some no doubt terrified in their final moments, others perhaps never even knowing what happened as ships broke apart and sank in seconds. The Great Lakes remain, vast and powerful, beautiful and deadly, waiting patiently for the next ship to make the wrong decision at the wrong time. The water flows, the waves rise and fall, the seasons turn from summer to autumn to the deadly storms of November, and somewhere beneath those waves, the spirits that indigenous peoples spoke of still dwell, whether as literal beings or as metaphors for powers beyond human control. The Great Lakes are dangerous. They have always been dangerous. They will always be dangerous. It was never the water. It was always everything else. The wind, the waves, the weather, the rocks, the ice, and the human choices that put ships and sailors in harm's way despite all warnings. Now rest. Let the waves lap gently at imagined shores. Let the wind quiet to a whisper. Let the storms pass over harmlessly. Tomorrow the ships will sail again. Captains will make their decisions, and the lakes will wait, patient and eternal, for the moment when conditions align and another name is added to the long list of vessels claimed by waters that were never quite what they seemed.